So the first presentation this morning is going to provide you with an introduction to the Manure Management Network. And then we're going to have two very nice presentations about various projects within the network, which you're probably very familiar with, the DATAMAN Project and the MELS Project. So the first presentation is by Professor David Chadwick from Bangor University in Wales. And Dave's going to talk about the introduction to the Manure Management Network. And this introduction will cover the history and the establishment of the network, the scope, the deliverables, and the relationships with other international projects, including DATAMAN and MELS, which we're going to hear about later. And he'll also talk about the future priorities of the Manure Management Network. So over to you, Dave. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sinead. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. Yep, okay, great. So many thanks for that, Sinead. Yeah, over the next 10 minutes or so, well, I'm delighted to be able to provide this summary of the activities and the aims and scope of the Manure Management Network. It's a forum really for scientists like yourselves focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from livestock production. But as I'll explain a little bit later, in some of the earlier meetings, we really discussed the scope of the network and where the boundaries should be drawn on it. And it became clear that we needed to think about increasing that scope so that it included nutrient use efficiency of manures and indeed excreta, managing excreta in its totality. I'll explain that in a little moment. But just to explain that the network's not new, you know, it's been going almost 10 years now in various sort of levels of activity. Started back in 2011, following a sort of stock take of greenhouse gas mitigation strategies by the various countries that were involved in the GRA at the time. And then it sort of born out of that, and there were continued sort of surveys of what was being planned, specifically about manure research across the countries. And that's when we started to discuss what the key priorities should be in the scope. And there were follow-up meetings in, you know, on the sort of outside of other big conferences like the GGAA, the Greenhouse Gas Animal Agriculture conferences in Dublin and Melbourne. But then after that, it went into a bit of dormancy, and it was only last year, really, that several of us wondered whether it was an opportune time to re-energize the network. So a bit about the history, and the scope of the network is really to understand that there's a growing number of research groups who are really interested in improving their greenhouse gas emissions inventories, so they want good data to quantify their emissions, but also looking at the mitigation, of course. And, you know, because we want to accelerate our knowledge and our understanding of greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation, it's important that we try to use similar methods, if not the same methods, so we can compare and utilize each other's data across different research groups and communities. So the first part of this, you know, the major scope was to address that challenge. How do we adopt and identify standardized measurements and modeling approaches? Secondly, the scope really about, you know, where these boundaries are for these sort of network in terms of quantifying and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from the manure management chain. I mean, I think many of us are familiar with the sort of housing, storage and application phases of the manure management chain, but, you know, there's a need to think beyond that in terms of animal excreta, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail in the next slide. But I think what became clear in those early discussions of the network were that when you start to try and manage and mitigate at certain parts of the manure management chain, then you can have repercussions further down that chain. And it's important to think about the leakiness of particularly the nitrogen cycle. So it was difficult to think of just looking at greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation per se, because of the potential trade-offs and hopefully co-benefits of greenhouse mitigation on things like ammonia, volatilization, nitrate leaching, crop available nitrogen and losses to water. And if you have all of those losses taking place, then it's important to think how they impact then on the nutrient availability and utilization when you apply that subsequent manure to the soil. So, you know, it was important to think about this much broader scope. So this This diagram really sort of depicts what you might normally see as the manure management chain running through from the animal house where the manure is generated into the store. There may well be some treatment, whether that be anaerobic digestion, acidification, separation, slurry separation, composting in this sort of storage phase. And then of course that manure then gets moved out to the field where it's applied. And as I said before, those of us who've done a lot of work in manure management, particularly in ammonia emissions, are well aware of the fact that you might do something to reduce emissions, for example, at the storage stage. But if you don't do anything to reduce those emissions at the land spreading phase, when you spread the manure, you can lose all the benefit that you've accrued during the store. So you've got to really think about managing these emissions all the way through the chain. And then when we talk about this extended manure management chain, it's in recognition really that most of our ruminant livestock, or in many countries, a lot of the ruminant livestock have a housing phase. So the more time that the animals are in the animal house, the more manure is generated. And when the animals are outdoors grazing, then they're depositing urine and dung to the soil. And technically, that urine and dung deposited to the soil is not managed. It's not manure, not in a technical definition. And yet, it's important to think about these greenhouse gas emissions from all of the excreta if we think of this more at a systems level. So it's important to include the grazing animal and the emissions generated at that point as well. So that was the conclusion, of how we should draw the boundaries. We should really look at the whole excretal management chain, I suppose, rather than the manure management chain. So what do we hope to deliver within the manure management network? And of course, this will change. It's flexible. It's open to the members to discuss this and help to prioritize what we should be looking at. But clearly, one of the things is to explore the use of common experimental protocols for measuring greenhouse gases and ammonia from each stage of that extended manure management chain. I think we'll all probably recognize that a huge amount of work is available and been done on the land spreading side of things, and it's because it's probably a little bit easier to do it there. It's quite technically challenging to measure emissions from animal buildings and stores, manure stores. Next, it was to try and draw up a list of mitigation strategies with underpinning literature to support those for the range of manure production systems, livestock systems relevant to the members. And importantly, to list a minimum reporting of greenhouse gas fluxes and metadata for journal articles. I think many of us can get quite frustrated with the lack of reported information in journal articles that prevents us from including data in meta-analyses going forward. So it's just trying to get that minimum reporting. And I know there have been journal articles to suggest what's needed, particularly for the land spreading side of manures and fertilizer applications and greenhouse gas emissions, but much less so for emissions from some of the other stages of manure management. It's also important we explore the use of consistent approaches for quantifying nutrient fertilizer replacement rates. I think that was something that was recognized quite early on in the network. And clearly we want to have an impact on policy recommendation going forward, particularly to support the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, we recognize there's a lot of great work already going on within the world. And the Manure Management Network has to be seen within that greater context. But there's great opportunity to add value to international projects, and we're going to hear about two great projects in a moment, DATAMAN and MELS. And I think Tony and Barbara will both be telling you that there's opportunity to get involved and make use of data sets and tools that are generated, if not even to help contribute to either this version or future versions of these projects. So, it's to try and raise awareness and show the network what's available, how they can get involved. So moving forwards, currently the Manure Management Network is very much made up of a relatively small group of us, after a period of quite limited activity. So we really want to grow the network beyond this core group. We need to identify the needs across the different research groups for the experimental protocols for each of the sort of measurement of each of the phases of manure management or excretal management. We want to encourage researchers and policymakers even to utilize knowledge and data that is generated either directly by the Manure Management Network or via this extended network of projects that are being done by these by the members. And in that direct context, it's to extend things like DATAMAN and MELS beyond their existing end dates. But of course, Barbara and Tony can talk much more to that. We want to try and encourage researchers to ensure that they report the metadata that goes alongside greenhouse gas measurements and mitigation strategies, so that we can really help future-proof further research through meta-analysis and modelling. And clearly we want to identify funding opportunities that support the Manure Management Network activities, whether it's these or ones that come forwards. And that can be done through greater networking, which we hope that this network will actually produce. You have an instant cohort of people to talk to if there are any funding opportunities. CliffGrad is a great opportunity for PhD students that I think many of us make use of in terms of applying for, but I personally have applied for many of those, but never actually directly for the Manure Management Network side of things. So I think there's greater opportunity to do that as well. So I think, yeah, that's my last slide. What I'd say is, if you've got immediate questions, obviously we can take those at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to contact myself or Tony or Professor Dong Hong Min, who's also one of the co-coordinators of the network, for further information. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dave, for that introduction. And as Dave said there, we would encourage everyone who works in the area of manure management to get involved in the network, because we're really trying to invigorate this network. And thanks to Dave and to the speakers this morning and others for making a real effort to invigorate the network. So moving on just to the DATAMAN project, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tony van der Weerden from AgResearch in New Zealand to give his presentation explaining more about the DATAMAN project. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Sinead. I'll just get the slideshow up. Right, hopefully you can see that now. Okay, so look, hello everybody. I'm going to provide a bit of a talk around this particular project. It's been a huge effort by a lot of people across the world. Plenty of people in Europe, as well as a few in South America and Chile, as well as Australia and here in New Zealand. Now, this particular project, we're going to focus on various aspects of the project. I'm going to talk about the aim of the work as well as the objectives. I'll address how we've collated the database that's now online, briefly touch on the results that we're seeing in some of the analysis, and then go to where we're going to go next. So the DATAMAN project itself has got partners, as I mentioned, within Europe, as well as New Zealand and Australia and Chile, and they're shown in the red dots there. But we've also got data coming in from a lot of other countries as well, shown in the yellow dots. There's still huge scope for this database to grow. The database at the moment has been collated with the effort of those in the project. There's still plenty of information out there that needs to be collated. So in terms of the aims of this project, we're really looking at providing access to the most up-to-date knowledge on how to manage manures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's the ultimate aim of this project. We're going to achieve that through 4 key areas of work. The first is to have this publicly accessible database on greenhouse gas emissions from manure management. The second is developing relationships between key variables and the emission factors that we've identified. Thirdly, looking at some guidelines in terms of how to improve national inventories. And fourthly, focusing on some of the mitigation options and quantifying what those reductions can be. So in terms of manure management systems, what are we talking about? These are a few pretty pictures, I guess, to illustrate what livestock housing and manure management, manure storage systems might look like in various parts of the world, coming from Southeast Asia, from Africa, the UK as well as New Zealand. And here we have some images of land application of manure, as well as direct deposition of dung and urine during grazing. So just a few shots to give you an idea of the sort of scope of systems that we're looking at here. In terms of the project itself, the methodology, it's been broken up into 3 core areas of work. The first is the database construction. Secondly, the statistical analysis and modeling of the data that we've collated. And thirdly, around inventory refinement. Now, this first one here, database construction, that has been, it's been an iterative process. So we've got arrows moving in all directions here. The key variables that have been selected have been developed initially by the project team, but we've sort of found that as we've collated data, we've needed to go back to some of those variables and add some more. So it's been a very much, like I say, an iterative process. I'm just going to look at the database construction component initially. So once we had agreed on those key variables, which was a huge job, and when I say that, we were still deciding on variables even as late as last year for the housing and storage templates. Once we have those in place, then we can get that collation of data started. And so the field data was collated starting back in September 2018 and through to March last year. That was a combination of peer-reviewed papers and conference papers, theses, very much driven by Ignacio Beltran, a postdoc that was funded by the GRA as a LEARN fellow, which has been fantastic. So Ignacio has been working on this project full time. He's collated a lot of data from developing countries. And on top of that, we've got data sets coming into this database, which has been also a fantastic resource. People involved in these existing databases being involved in the project. So the ALPHAN2 database addresses ammonia emissions from manure applied to land, very much a European project, and that was led by Sasha Hafner. And then the AIDA database is a UK database, which Rachel Thorman was directly involved with, and so she's been instrumental in bringing through the UK data into this data set. And then the ELF database was recently published from the French group of researchers, and so Melinda Usama has been very helpful there, involved in the project in helping to translate that data through to the DATAMAN database. So having these large data sets coming in has helped to grow the data sets hugely, very quickly. We have then got a quality control aspect in there, which for the papers, not for the databases that were brought into the project, but for the individual studies, a QC process to ensure that there's that quality control aspect is in there. That's a time-consuming process, but obviously very important. And then we've got the field housing and storage data split up. And recently we had the field data published, which just came out a few weeks ago. And that's Ignacio really driving that. So that's online and it's open access as well. In terms of the database, so this is available online as well. It's useful for inventory compilers, for researchers, for tool developers, such as on-farm greenhouse gas management tool, measurement tools. At the moment, it contains the field data, so it's limited to nitrous oxide and ammonia emissions at the moment only. That will extend in June this year. We will bring in housing and storage data. Currently, it contains over 5,000 emission factors gathered from 25 countries. Very easy to access. There's a simple registration process, and that'll bring you through to, once your registration has been acknowledged or accepted, then you've got access to that database. It contains data from quite a few countries. So the nitrous oxide emission factors, they are dominated by, I guess, 3 or 4 countries: New Zealand, UK, Kenya, and Brazil. Wet temperate climates dominate the N2O data set. But when it comes to the ammonia emission factors, it's pretty much close to 100% being data gathered from wet temperate climates. Mainly coming from the UK, Denmark, Canada, and the Netherlands. So clearly, it's quite an unbalanced data set, very obvious. So it would be fantastic if we could get more effort coming into the African continent, as well as Asia. India in particular, Indian subcontinent, we don't have any data there at all, and we currently don't really have any contacts. So we would like to reach out to Indian subcontinent as well as East Asia for data to enrich in this database. Now for Africa, we've got some nice numbers coming through from Kenya and Zimbabwe. Kenya has been very active, publishing a fair bit of work recently, the International Livestock Research Institute. So that's been very a valuable source of information, but again, there's still a lot of countries there where we don't have any data coming through. So yes, lots of opportunity. In terms of the data set at the moment, it's for nitrous oxide. What type of manures have we got in there? It's dominated by urine and dung as the end source, with slurry coming in next. And then for ammonia, it's very much dominated by slurry studies. When it comes to the manure treatments, most of the data has had no treatment at all. 82% of the manure applied hasn't been treated in any way. For the nitrous oxide studies, 14% of the data set have been treated with, 40% of the N sources have been treated with a nitrification inhibitor relating to E2O emission factors. And then we've also got, I guess, some studies there looking at the effect of nitrification inhibitors on ammonia emissions, which has been an area of interest for some research institutes, researchers. A little bit of work on anaerobic digestion and acidification, but plenty of scope to grow these data sets further. In terms of the actual DATAMAN database features when you go online, so there you'll see tabulated data. There's an online function for looking at the frequency of different values. This is an example on the right here. So that's pretty much connected to the database directly for both nitrous oxide and ammonia, so you get a sense of how much data exists. And you can download all of the data or selected variables. And as I mentioned, the housing and storage data will be added by June this year. In terms of going on to the statistical analysis of the data, first I just want to touch on the fact that we have this database, but there are a lot of holes in it. There are many areas where we just don't have data, lots of gaps. So we saw an opportunity to increase the number of observations by utilizing data that's been published, but it's what am I trying to say? So if we've got information on volumetric water content, for instance, then we could increase, we could translate that into water-filled pore space, for example. If we've got information on manure N content and manure carbon content, but they haven't provided a CN ratio, we can clearly do that calculation for them. So we've gone through the database and been able to derive additional parameters for the analysis in terms of looking at the drivers of emissions. Now, these derived values are not stored in the database because they weren't part of the original publication. These have been calculated and analyzed within R, within the stats program that we use. So that's been a useful function to add to the project. In terms of areas of focus, for the field data, we're very much focused on trying to improve the IPCC emission factors, tier 1 type emission factors, and looking at the disaggregation of emission factors. So with the 2019 refinement of the IPCC guidelines, there was a move towards starting to disaggregate tier 1 emission factors according to climate or some other factor. So we're sort of built on that. So the first area is around ammonia emission factors for cattle manures. We've been able to separate solid and slurry. So that'll be a new emission factor coming through. When it comes to nitrous oxide emission factors, for cattle manure, we've been able to revise the values that exist for wet and dry climates. And then for dung and urine deposition from cattle and sheep, we've revised the values that exist for wet and dry climates there too. They haven't changed very much, but it's just really an update with a larger data set. Now, just to give you an example of what else we've been doing with that data, when it comes to the dung and urine, at the moment, we have these separate emission factors, one for urine and one for dung. But of course, at a tier 1 level in the IPCC guidelines, we present an emission factor based on the excreta, which is taking into consideration that you've got dung and urine being deposited. So you're looking at the total N that's being excreted. So what we've done with the data is to consider the effect of the diet, the N in the diet, and how that influences that ratio of urine nitrogen to dung nitrogen. That at the moment in the guidelines has been, that's how the current excreta value was calculated from dung and urine. And it was conducted, well, that calculation in the current guidelines or current refinement is based on an N content of 3%. Now, of course, for some countries, that's too high. That's going to be on the high side. Some countries will have a lower N content than 3% of the diet. So we saw an opportunity here to develop a relationship between the N content of the diet and the excreta nitrous oxide emission factor. So this would provide inventory compilers with an option to estimate emission factors based on the typical N content of their diet in their country or region of the country. So this is sort of work in progress, and hopefully we're going to be submitting this work very soon. Then I'll just touch briefly on mitigation and key drivers, just to give you a flavor of what we're doing here. In terms of mitigation, we're focused on 2 areas, and they're very well established areas, but I guess what we've got is a larger data set now. So that gives us an opportunity to do some further analysis on quantifying these different methods and determining if there are significant differences between them. So for cattle and pig slurry, looking at the low emission methods of application, banding and injection, trailing hoses, trailing shoes. So we've looked at that in terms of emission factors. And we've also been looking at the nitrification inhibitors being applied to dung and urine as well as to manures. In terms of the drivers, these are all preliminary, but for drivers, a couple of examples there from our analysis. Ammonia emissions factors for pig slurry. Finally, we've got 3 significant variables driving that particular source or loss from pig slurry. Increasing manure dry matter content seems to increase the emission factor, decreasing soil organic carbon, and increasing wind speed. The blue, they sort of all make sense, really. I guess the organic carbon, that's going to be immobilizing some of that ammonium that's in the system, and so that's going to reduce the amount of ammonia that's lost from the soil surface. Another one relates, another example is nitrous oxide losses from cattle urine. And here we're seeing that both water content and pH are positively associated with a nitrous oxide emission factor. So that's just giving you a little bit of a flavor of the type of work we're doing. This is ongoing. So hopefully we'll see that progress a little bit more quickly than it has been in the last few weeks and months. Now, I just want to touch on the housing and storage. So far, we've done all our analysis on the field data, And within the DATAMAN project, we're still collating housing and storage information, which will then be assessed within the MELS project. Now, with the housing and storage, we noticed when it comes to field studies, you do get a lot of publications presenting an emission factor, which is fantastic, and that's exactly what we want. We want to be able to collate that data for our analysis. But when it comes to housing and storage, often emission factors are not reported, or they're not reported the way we want them. So we're after a particular type of unit, I guess. So when it comes to ammonium and nitrous oxide, we're looking at kilograms of nitrogen lost per kilogram of nitrogen excreted or stored. For methane, we're looking at kilograms of methane per kg of volatile solids excreted or stored. Now, in many publications, they report rates or cumulative losses, but don't actually go to the point of calculating an emission factor. So we saw this as a little bit of a challenge, because we weren't getting a lot of data coming through that was supplied from the publications. So we wanted to address this. Clearly, we wanted to increase the number of emission factors. So we worked with Webb in the UK to develop a method that would allow us to derive or estimate emission factors. Now, the derived emission factors are based on using information that's reported in the study, whereas an estimated emission factor would be relying on default values that may be national values, such as typical ammoniacal N content of cattle slurry for Denmark, or the typical live weight of a pig in France, for example. A couple of examples of the type of parameters that would be used for estimating emission factors. In doing this, we managed to increase the number of data more than fivefold, which has allowed us to give us a much richer data set to work with. So that's where we've got to in the last several weeks, I guess, or about a month ago. The next step will be within MELS to do an analysis to determine if there are significant differences between these supplied, derived, and estimated emission factors. Okay, so now I'm just going to move on to inventory refinement. There's just really not much to say here. One slide really. And here we've, within the DATAMAN project, we've developed a couple of case studies in terms of guidelines for improving inventories. These case studies are from New Zealand and Chile. They can be found on the GRA website under the DATAMAN project. And so they focus on manure management, obviously. And in each of these case studies, the current inventory method is described, and then recommendations for improvements are provided. Okay, so now I'm going to just touch on where we're going next with this work. So we hope to complete the field data analysis very soon and publish these findings. So our second manuscript is close to submission to that point. These emission factors that are in the second manuscript, they will then be submitted to the IPCC emission factor database, and then they'll be available for inventory compilers to utilize. And then we need to still complete our analysis of the drivers of emission factors. And that will help to identify potential mitigation strategies and provide information for those working on models, farm scale models in particular. We'll continue to collate housing and storage data, and as I mentioned, update the website in June this year. And then clearly this work will continue, and so that's continuing under the MELS project, mitigating emissions from livestock manures, systems, sorry. And so Barbara's presentation will look at that shortly. In terms of identifying gaps in future research, I think there's two key areas here. The first is the need for a larger, richer database. And as Dave said, we're keen to have more people involved in the network, and definitely keen to involve more people supplying data and being involved in this project as well. It's unbalanced, as I said, and so we're definitely looking for more information coming through from Asia, Africa, South America, but also other countries too. The second part of this really is around the continued free access to the database. So we're currently funded through to December 2022, so through the Global Research Alliance, we've got that funding. So we need to explore how we continue that funding to ensure that the databases, they're online and available already. And through the two of those together, then we continue to improve emission factors and continue the analysis on mitigation technologies to see how we can reduce emissions and improve nutrient use efficiency. Okay, so now I just want to I guess, touch on a few lessons learned through this whole project. These are probably, I guess, on a personal note. What's been it's been an interesting process. Patience is so important. The time it took to agree on templates, key variables for the templates, that was, like I said, it was an iterative process, but we got there. And yeah, that took a lot of time. And same with the analysis of the data. So these, when scoping these types of projects out for future, just bear that in mind, how much time it takes to work through these collation and analyses of data. The second point is around the balancing act. So we've got a lot of variables, huge numbers of variables in these data sets, databases. If we have too many, then that may turn people off in terms of wanting to submit data. But if we have too few, then we don't have enough richness in that data set to actually conduct the analysis that we need to identify the key drivers. So there is a balance there. But, you know, I guess we do need to ensure that we've got sufficient variables there to be able to investigate what are the key drivers. The third point is, and this is this morning, is a prime example, flexible working hours. It's great, fantastic, always wonderful working with my colleagues on this project, but it does require flexibility. So yeah. Okay, I just want to acknowledge the funders of this work. So this is supported by the GRA with funding from New Zealand's Ministry of Primary Industries, as well as UK's DEFRA. And then also I want to acknowledge all my colleagues in this project, and also make a note of those that have not actually had funding, providing in-kind support time to this work. That's been a huge effort on their part. And lastly, the field researchers that we've been in touch with. So the publications don't always have the data that we are looking for. So in some cases, we've gone back to them to ask if they actually have that information. And we've, on the whole, had a very positive response and a lot of support from the researchers providing that input. So yeah, thank you to you if you're listening. Okay, so this is a little slide saying questions and discussion, but we're going to actually cover this, we go into this after we've heard from Barbara. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for the very comprehensive overview of DATAMAN. And again, you know, we'd welcome people to join these projects and get in touch with Tony and the others involved in the Manure Management Network. Can I ask you to please try and submit questions? Questions are a bit slow coming in, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask the presenters this morning, just submit them in the Q&A box below on your screen, and we'll take them all at the end. Also, this webinar is recorded, so it'll be made available on the GRA website for others who couldn't make it this morning to view it at a later time. So now moving to Europe for our final presentation today. So I'd like to welcome Professor Barbara Amon, who's going to talk to us about the MELS project, which basically builds on the DATAMAN project, as Tony spoke about there. So thank you, Barbara, if you want to start presenting now.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Oh, no, that's wrong. Now this is the right presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, you can put into presentation. Yeah,
Okay.
presentation mode. Yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Barbara.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce you briefly to the MELS project, which is a follow-up project to the DATAMAN. I would like to start with a very brief overview of what we want to do in MELS. National and international regulations require significant reductions in greenhouse gas and nitrogen emissions in the short and in the long term. This will demand the implementation of existing and new mitigation technologies and their integration into national emission inventories. Research on emission and emission mitigation has a long history with a wealth of published literature around the globe. However, despite the huge amount of literature, mitigation measures have not sufficiently made it into practice. There is a well-known science policy gap. Making scientific knowledge effective in addressing livestock emissions requires synthesis of evidence first and then decision support. A major impact of the MELS project will be to allow the effect of the context to be better taken into account, both at the national and at the farm scale. The detailed and context-specific inventorying of greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions via appropriate activity data and emission factors is crucial to implement mitigation measures, and it is very relevant for circularity of carbon and nitrogen fluxes in agriculture. At this purpose, MELS will expand the existing emission database DATAMAN, and MELS partners are currently adding greenhouse gas and ammonia emission data, widening the geographical coverage of the database in order to include data from Eastern and Southern Europe, China, and Latin America. In the next step, data analysis will allow to model the relationships between activity data and emissions, aiming to describe greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions under different management and environmental characteristics. This will be the basis for the MELS decision support. The assessment of manure-related emissions from livestock systems will be accompanied along the whole project duration by stakeholder interaction. In particular, mitigation measures will be discussed in consultation actions with the livestock production sector. The aim is to empower the agricultural sector in understanding the effects of mitigation options and operate different mitigation choices tailored for farming conditions. This leads us to the two outputs that MELS will deliver. The first is a prototype of a farm-scale decision support system. The prototyping of this software will be based on the review of already existing decision support systems and on the assessment of future demands from the agricultural sector. The second outcome will be the improvement of national inventories and projections. MELS will interact with policymakers and inventory compilers, transferring its scientific results into achieve higher accuracy and reportability of greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions in national inventory reports. By doing this, MELS reduces costs of collecting activity data and investigates how transparency can be retained in the more complex emission inventories that MELS foresees for the future. The MELS consortium is around a range of European partners because MELS is funded by the European program AeroNet, but we also have the pleasure to have a wide geographical range, partly by partners from New Zealand and Chile, and also by our highly valued advisory board from Embrapa Brazil and CAS in China. MELS has several work packages. I think the work package 2, data collation and management, has been explained by Tony already in detail. We will build upon the DATAMAN database and add data from Eastern and Southern Europe, from Latin America and China to widen the geographical range of the database. In Work Package 3, we do the component modeling. Here, we develop functional relationships of greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions from farm components for the manure management chain. And we develop mechanisms to incorporate mitigation measures into the functional relationships. We already had, the project is ongoing. It started in January last year and will continue until December 2022. So last year we had a 5 weeks mini online workshop led by AgResearch in New Zealand, because we could not meet in person due to the COVID restrictions. And this was the starting point to the development of a written guideline on data analysis. And on this guideline, our current analysis is being built upon. Work Package 4, the farm scale greenhouse gas decision support. Here, we review and characterize existing farm scale decision support systems. And we assess the future demand of such systems and we would like to include the future role for ICT and sensor technologies. That means mitigation measures that might not yet have been implemented or fully researched, but they should also be enabled to be included in the new decision support system. We recommend improvements to greenhouse gas and cost calculations in existing farm scale decision support systems. And we will produce a flexible prototype farm scale decision support systems for countries without an existing system. For example, in our consortium, Poland will be one of the countries to develop such a new system. And work package number 5, improving national inventories. So we want to do two things. First, the decision support system for the farmer to be operated at farm level. And second, to bring the mitigation measures and their effects into improved national inventories to show their effect under international regulations for the IPCC, the greenhouse gases, and the UNECE, who is working on air pollutant regulations. We want to improve accuracy and reportability of agricultural greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions. We want to quantify the costs and benefits of mitigation measures in national inventories. Also important to reduce the cost of collecting activity data, because inventories can only work properly if they have sufficiently accurate activity data. But of course, the collection of activity data at farm level is costly, and we must carefully decide which of the activity data are key for improved national inventory. So this key factor analysis will also be a part of the project. And finally, we need to investigate how transparency can be retained in the more complex inventories, because inventories need to be transparent and they need to pass the international review process. And as you can see, work package 6, consultation and dissemination, goes along the whole project and is a very, very important column of the project. We have various levels of dissemination and consultation. We have transnational consultation to ensure that views of the main stakeholders are taken into account. We have the national dissemination, where each partner disseminates project outcomes to stakeholders in each partner country, also in their own languages. And we have the wider international dissemination, the scientific community and the international policies. Some examples you can find here on the slide. Our project also has a website, and we are on Twitter and ResearchGate. So finally, just to summarize the main purpose of the MELS project, we want to support decisions and policies on mitigating manure management emissions. And this closes my talk, and I am very much looking forward to answer questions and enter discussion with you. Thank you for participating.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for a very nice presentation and nice follow-on from DATAMAN. So now I welcome some questions, and I'm going to start just looking at the questions here that were added in. The first one says, as you know, manure is related to animal nutrition. I would like to ask, what is the relationship between manure and animal nutrition? Also, what kind of nutrients and feed are used in the project? So who would like to take that question?
I can have a go at that. So I guess
Tony.
it's really in relation to the DATAMAN project. So yes, animal nutrition and manures are very, very much related. The project itself has focused on the conditions of manure management in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but clearly diet will influence manure characteristics. There has been a parallel project called CEDARS, which is, gosh, what does it mean? Capturing, help me, Barbara, you're part of this. Capturing.
Yeah, but I also know, I know what it's about, but I don't know the exact wording. It's about following the influence.
Oh, on, Sinead?
No, it's part of the feed network. So
yes. So as thick as capturing emission, it's to do with diet. I should have that at the top of my tongue.
It's capturing the diet effects downstream the manure management chain, but I don't know the exact wording.
We make the word CEDARS out of it. So that's focusing very much on how diet is influencing manure characteristics, and so that would capture. Yes, I think, Mohammed, that would help you in that area. Within the DATAMAN template, we have variables that are set there for the feed. So if we knew what feed was being offered to the animals, then we would be capturing that in the database as well. Unfortunately, the type of studies that we've been collating have not included a lot of information about the feed. But I think that's something that will come in time as this work evolves. There may even be the potential for the CEDARS database, because they have their own one, to be amalgamated with the DATAMAN database. Who knows? It would be wonderful if we could somehow look at that and see if there's potential opportunity to bring the two together.
Yeah, good idea. Another question here. 1 second. Does the MELS project have any prospect of extension in Africa? Barbara.
Yeah, we are always happy to receive additional data. That is very obvious. And if we have a candidate from Africa who wants to participate and contribute data, we would be very happy to welcome. So if the sender of this question might want to contact me via email after this project, after this meeting today, I'd be happy to get in contact.
I'll just add to that.
Sorry, yes, Tony, go ahead.
So we do have Ignacio Beltran involved in the project collating data from developing countries for the MELS project. So that's gathering data from as many countries as we can. Data back to below. So that's in one direction, but this clearly thinking about the return action.
We searched the database for publications on emission data, and obviously there is not too much from Africa that we found. The funds that we found we have included in the database, but it is always good, and Ignacio has done a very great job here, but it's of course always welcome to add more data.
Thank you, Barbara. There's a long question here in relation to farmers' attitudes. I don't know if you got a chance to read it, but really what he's saying is while collecting slurry from some farmers, the main priorities for them was homogeneity, flowability, and partly hydrogenization of slurry, which is achieved via stirring, which increases ammonia. When I asked farmers about their idea of ammonia reduction, they shrugged their shoulders and see if more of an additional burden, see as more additional burden. Really what this question is about is what are the farmers' attitudes and what is your experience with that, with their attitudes in reducing manures, greenhouse gases and ammonia? Do you want to come in there, Dave?
Yeah, I can start something on that. I think going back quite a long way, we were fortunate to have funding from our UK DEFRA to look at how farmers got on with manure mitigation equipment should we need it, because at the time the UK didn't really have to do anything to reduce its ammonia emissions above what it was already doing. And some of the positive things were the fact that farmers recognized that you could spread slurry, for example, much more cleanly. You could spread it below a growing canopy and have clean grass for silage later. There were positive things that they saw there. There were also positive things if farmers are spending a lot of money on fertilizing nitrogen. They could see that if you calculate the amount of ammonia emitted per dairy cow that a farmer has, and you put that into context as the total amount of nitrogen that's being lost from the system, and then explain that in terms of the amount of fertilizer and nitrogen saving that could be made, that's another incentive. But yeah, if we didn't have the current impending climate, we've got the clean air strategy in the UK. That is really going to have a major impact on how manures are going to be managed in the UK over the coming years. And without that probably real policy incentive, then farmers are less likely to do things unless they can see a tangible benefit like clean grass and a saving.
So really profitability as well as policy driven, I think, going forward. There's another question here for Barbara. This participant is saying a great presentation, Barbara. You've mentioned the role for ICT and sensor technologies as mitigation measures. Could you give some concrete examples or suggestions for literature on that topic?
Yes, we have investigated the literature. There is not much actual literature, especially on this topic, but we are quite sure that more will come up because precision farming, one of the aims of precision farming is to make better use of the nutrients and to reduce losses. And we have collected some literature, and if the lady who asked the question wants to send me an email after this seminar, I'm happy to provide her with the references.
That'd be a great idea. So if you email Barbara, she will send that information.
If possible, may I briefly add to the farmers' attitudes, because we are also very much in there, and I fully agree with Dave that the one important side is to show the benefits that the farmer has. And farmers are under stricter environmental regulations in many European countries, so they definitely need to reduce their emissions. And now the question is how to do this in an optimized way. So I think there is no possibility to say, I don't do anything for the environment. That is not a solution. So farmers will have to do something. And the question is, what do they do best? And this is one of our core aims of the project, to find for key European regions the mitigation measures that work best, that are most efficient and most cost effective. And this is also why we do this huge amount of data collection and then the very intensive statistical data analysis to find for key European regions and also across Europe for other regions in the world, the mitigation measures that would work best and at lowest costs. And here, the collaboration with the farming community is very important because we need their input to guide us also which measures they would consider practical on their farms. So I think the stakeholder interaction is very crucial to bring this project to a benefit.
Thank you, Barbara, for adding to that. And some participants have told us that Cedars, of course, is capturing effective diet on emissions from ruminant systems. One last question here. Some ongoing work here in Denmark on the low-cost ammonia emissions measurement technology for animal housing could be used by farmer and regulators to monitor emissions. And thank you for that comment, Nick. So we've just run out of time. We're right on the hour. I would like to draw this webinar to a close. I'd like to thank sincerely our three speakers this morning, Dave, Barbara and Tony, for really excellent presentations and for a great overview of some of the exciting activities going on in the Manure Management Network. And hopefully all of us working together can grow that network over the coming years. And it's an exciting time to get involved in the network. So I'd like to encourage everybody out there who knows of other groups working in the area who are not involved to introduce them to the network and get them into it. That would be wonderful. I'd like to also take the opportunity to thank the GRA Secretariat for their help in putting this webinar together, particularly Deborah Knox for her assistance in organising the webinar. And hopefully we can have another one soon and more of these types of webinars. And wishing you all a really great day and thank you for joining us this morning. Goodbye.